Finally, the last but not the least among our expert presenters will speak about politics, power relations, and his particular topic is actually the end of great powers and the beginning of solidarity. Who is our presenter? Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet and to, for those who know him already, I'd like you to welcome our final speaker presenter for today, Dr. Kevin Henry Villanueva. He is a political thinker and essayist of international relations at the University of the Philippines. His theoretical work focuses on the communicative spaces of peoples and the conditions of freedom and solidarity in world politics, such as the idea of, quote unquote, the global life. He has studied the international human rights regime and the ASEAN regional integration. He writes at the intersection of philosophy, international relations, and political science. His experience in international service spans Southeast Asia and Western Europe, including International Alert, which is, my understanding, this is a London-based organization, the European Commission, and ASEAN. He was ASEAN Fulbright Visiting Scholar at the American University in Washington, D.C., currently Taiwan Fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Affairs at the National Chung Cheng University. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Dr. Kevin Henry Villanueva. The floor is yours.
All right. Yes. Thank you very much, Edna. Good evening, America. I take it. Magandang umaga sa Pilipinas. Maayong umaga, right? I should perhaps I should begin by saying that I am very much honored and grateful to be welcomed and to be invited to talk about my research, right? I've only got 20 minutes. I wish I could see all of you, and I don't know if Dr. Delina is there, all right? But I would like to also start by saying that the presentations have been extremely overwhelming. And what I would therefore like to do in the next 20 minutes is to somehow adapt my presentation, right? First, in terms or in light of what I'm doing, of my research, right? I am here, good morning from Taiwan, right? From the discipline where I come from, which is international relations, right? Number two, in light of what is the substantive question of the day, right? Which is COVID-19 or the virus, okay? The great virus, so to speak. And finally, in light of the evidence which has been presented in the preceding papers, okay? Now let me start, all right? In light of my research, the register is slightly different in principle because I would like, I do theoretical work and specifically normative work. The reason why I'm doing this is because I am at the core not very happy or unsatisfied, right, with the way that we are looking at international politics, largely or mainly from the system of states. And the reason why this is so is because the vocabulary that we have, hang on to that first, Fred, right? The vocabulary that I shall tell you when the slide is to come, the vocabulary that we have, right, is fundamentally looking at notions of sovereignty, notions of power, notions of territory, which all the preceding papers have actually touched on, right? But we haven't looked at notions of solidarity. We haven't sufficiently looked at the idea of processes, right? And here, my ontological bias must be made explicit or evident. Can't see. Hold on. Sorry, the batteries just went down. Now, ontologically, I take human agency, all right? State agency inherently limited, right? So when I talk about politics in general and world politics or global politics more specifically, right? I am looking at ideas of processes, specifically material and social processes, right? And here I'd like to talk a little bit about the politics of encounter, all right? And see how its implications for the way that we are looking at or understanding the impact of the crisis that we face today. Okay. Let me begin, all right? In the long of the 20th century, okay, we have seen America, the United Kingdom, Russia, and China, in the words of then the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the four policemen, lead and manage the international system and the world at various stages and in varying degrees. Let's look at the slide. Fred, please. Okay. If we are to look back at some of the transformative points in the last century, beginning from the First and Second World Wars, there was some general consensus on the priority of keeping the peace that was won by the Allied powers and maintaining international security by controlling the proliferation of nuclear wars, of nuclear arms. The wartime conferences that we will see later on, hang on to that slide yet, Mr. Fred, in Newfoundland, Casablanca, Cairo, Tehran, Dumbarton Oaks and Bretton Woods, in the US, Yalta, and finally Potsdam, all demonstrated a desire for world organization, no less than a contest for leadership and hegemony. Okay. As well as a vision for world order that up until the end of the century held up hope, not least as can be demonstrated in the creation of the United Nations. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was thought to signal rather apocalyptically the triumph of liberal democracy as the only viable model of political organization. From that time on, America, leading the liberal international order, as we now call it, right, enjoyed what we called, quote unquote, its unipolar moment on the world stage. And then the 11th of September happened, when at the heart of its cosmopolitan culture in New York, two planes crashed into the Twin Towers in the name of jihad. This led us to question in whose name progress and democracy was being spread in the world. Democracy and the fight for human rights was, in a way then, in various parts of the world, strangled by the war on terror. Just as it was, I think, possibly about to gain speed and take off. Barack Obama was then elected to the White House. It was a strong symbol and reminder that all is possible in America. In the meantime, as the plans for a pivot to Asia were being drawn, China, awaking to its great power status, slowly, as it were, left its lair. Recall the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, including the rollout of infrastructure and development assistance to Africa and Latin America. And think about our own country, the Philippines, as part of an international network of Chinese loans. Wins the elections, and as the new occupant of the White House, makes friends and enemies on a whim, blurring for his country whatever distinctions there may have been between traditional allies and old rivalries. The dominant discourse of his presidency is, quote unquote, America first, And for Xi Jinping, it is China, quote unquote, as a community of destiny. Both appear to be playing on different versions of capitalism. The former is market-led and the latter is, quote unquote, state-led. But the effective hand continues to be the state, the sovereign, the Leviathan. Right? Were so, all right, to call their game, we now hear this oftentimes, the new Cold War. Okay. Hides or conceals a lot of the truth. It is not only to betray the premises on which the resulting framework for a semblance of world order took shape in the 20th century, all right? You will see that somehow we always had one or two great powers somehow, right, fashioning the rules through which we were able to create international institutions and through which we were able to relate as countries, right? But they also endanger the new models of international cooperation, which are taking shape at the beginning of the 21st century. So there's a sense of like thinking of what is going on now between America and China. It's a new Cold War is leading us into the direction and blinding us, all right, to new phenomena and specifically global problems, right? I will get to what we might call what are global problems eventually. The Cold War, much as it separated the world, and here, the Cold War, the Cold War, much as it separated the world, right, into two spheres, right, originated in a genuine desire and attempt to prevent war from ever happening again, not only between states, but also among peoples. The cost of human life and suffering was far too much to bear. Let's have a look at the next slide, Mr. Fred. All right, this is what I call the politics of encounter, right? An example of it. The way that our international institutions were built and the way that great powers in world politics, all right, thought about this was not whimsical. It was premeditated, right? It went through different stages, right? Our leaders spoke to each other, all right? They talked, all right? And here you have got somehow a chronological, right, table of the wartime conferences which happened from 1941 to 1945, which eventually established the liberal international order, the second half of the 20th century, up until today, right? Although now we are questioning many of these international institutions, not only the United Nations, but in light of COVID, the World Health Organization. Okay. Now, what we see here, of course, is an official, right? An official account. What we don't see, for example, is that between Roosevelt and Churchill, between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, between Roosevelt, Churchill, eventually in Chiang Kai-shek, they had a machinery that was working for them, right? In the case of the UK, it was the Whitehall, and then in the case of the US, it was the State Department. The evidence on how the Chinese or how the Russians were thinking about this at that time, the Soviet Union were thinking about this, is not yet all too available. But there are records, right, of how, right, eventually the agreement to draw up an international organization that would prevent war, all right, was going on not only in the heads of heads of state, but also within the machineries of the state and the state departments. There was, contestation. Okay, and this is something that we don't know. We're not sure is actually happening now with the crisis or even before that. Okay. The two great powers, in this case, America and Russia, what was then the Soviet Union, had a common cause to begin with. The framework of rules within which international institutions, such as the agencies of the UN, were embedded ultimately enabled cooperation. Even if successive administrations from these two powers drew their own interpretations of settled international norms, including the expansion of the human rights regime and the cases of humanitarian interventions. That is to say that whatever suspicions, threats, and fears that great powers perceived in each other, because there were, right, and they disagreed, all right. In fact, Potsdam was the last time that the Soviet Union and America met each other, up until later on. Perestroika happened in the case of the Soviet Union, and then China with the open door policy and so on. To somehow presuppose that the spirit of dialogue, or what I call the politics of an original counter between the US and China, has taken place is to divest the notion of great powers, which is a status. Let me read. That is to say that whatever suspicions, threats, and fears that great powers perceived in each other, the set of rules over which they met and agreed actually provided an atmosphere of restraint and a sense of moral responsibility as members of the international community. To somehow presuppose today that the spirit of dialogue, or what I call the politics of an encounter between the US and China, has taken place is to divest the notion of great powers, which is a status that one gives to countries and its leaders so that they may exercise special rights and duties in the management of the international system, the essence of leadership, right? To actually be calling great powers, right, to the US and China now does not seem to be adequate, because we don't see them leading, right? The US and China are simply put, right, not on speaking terms. Right? It is time to ask the question, where have the great powers gone? Right? In a crisis of contagion such as the one that we now face, it is easy to feel a certain sense of deception, not least at the four horsemen in whose care we have somehow entrusted the international community that we, those who count ourselves as participants, have built in the course of at least 3 generations, to be able to appraise, appraise the present crisis. The preceding discussion was necessary because we have been, like it or not, beneficiaries of the long peace between America and Russia. In some ways, the present scenario is once again somehow making us choose between America and China. But neither of the two under their present administrations is qualified, able, and willing, because their ideals of the global life are centered on the transcendence of their own sovereignty and the preponderance of their military might. Right. Why should this discussion, let me end there briefly, right? Why should such a discussion matter? Okay. Let's look at the other slide. All right. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Right. Next slide, please. Right. Because I've got 5 minutes, so I shall move a little bit quicker. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. This ties in with what Dr. Padilla was talking about, all right? Here I did a quick research, right? And I have yet to access myself. I was able to get this through the New York Times. Pandemics are not new, we all know that, right? But look at this, right? This is the New York Times, and we're looking at, all right, the successive waves of the Spanish influenza in 1918, right? This is off the page of the New York Times on the 20th of December, 1918. You will not find any coverage of the influenza virus whatsoever at least from the front page and then from the all succeeding pages. From October onwards, if you look at the front page, naturally everything is all about war. Right? But then it's on the last page of the New York Times on the 20th of December 1918 that you actually see something. I've encircled it with a red. Between an advertisement for colors, all right, and apparently what I've been told is a news about somebody owning cables, all right. Absolutely obscure. You will want to ask, what was actually written there? 5 lines. Let's go to the next slide. Fred, please. This is what's written there. Uh-oh. 6 million, this is the title. 6 million died of influenza. And then the subtitle is regarded as world's greatest plague since the Black Death. Let's read that. The Times medical correspondent says that it seems reasonable to believe that throughout the world, 6 million persons have died from influenza and pneumonia during the last 3 months. It is estimated that the war caused the death of about 20 million people in 4.5 years. Thus, the correspondent points out, influenza has proved itself deadlier than war because in the same period at its epidemic rate, influenza would have killed 100 million. Never since the Black Death has such a plague swept over the world, he says, adding that the need of a new survey of public health measures has never been more forcibly illustrated. All right, a couple of things, a couple of points to ponder. All right, as we get into the, as we get into the forum or the talk. Number one is, yes, it is media, but at the same time, we've got to rethink the way that we are doing international relations, because that has been largely within the remit of states, and more specifically states' great powers. We have not looked at smaller states and those which are not considered states, such as the case of Taiwan, which was denied not only membership but even only observer status in the WHO. So information from societies, from peoples, right? And this somehow segues into what Dr. Delina was talking, right? Communities, right? Small-scale communities, which are in fact or potentially, all right, resilient, all right, in their managing of crises, not able to share that information. We are looking at problems, right, which are not restricted in geography, which are not restricted in time and space, but which have actually occurred, all right, all throughout human history, but we have not given them, all right, the kind of priority that we have, for example, given the kind of funding priorities over war. War is absolutely sexier, it's more visible, so on and so forth. But this is what we find, what was before COVID somehow kind of a silent death. Because in the case of influenza, it was not, the lessons were not only ignored, it was ignored at the very time that it was actually happening. There are various reasons for this. One reason is because we did not even know what a virus was, what that virus was. We did not have an image of that virus. And now we have an image of what that virus is. I tried to scan it, but I couldn't put it in my PowerPoint, okay? So there's one, what kind of model, right? So that whole society approach, for example, all right, that we were talking about, I think that Pip and Delina are talking about, right? Interdisciplinarity, so on, requires some kind of, I hesitate to call it modeling, right? But it requires definitely a different vocabulary outside of war. So the way that we're talking about the virus as a kind of a war is quite frankly erroneous, right? And it's dangerous because we are not facing a war, we're facing a pandemic, all right? And we're not simply looking at civil, we're not simply looking at the military solving this, but we're looking at health practitioners who are also able to strategize, right, the way that the state is strategizing in general. Okay. Let me end by saying, therefore, that just to touch a little bit on what Mayor Belmonte was saying, right? And then looking at Taiwan, Taiwan, I think, has somehow changed the way that I think about world politics in general, right? And it's about questioning, all right, what count as legitimate actors in international relations today, given that our problems, all right, and the solutions that are available no longer simply respond to world wars. They respond to the climate, right, to disasters caused by climatic conditions. They respond, therefore, all right, to the consequences of climatic decisions, such as food security, right? And here, this is also something that we have already known even before. The very existence of UP Los Baños and the University of the Philippines in the Visayas were a direct response, all right, to what we saw as problems of food security. But we have not thought carefully, or at least consciously and explicitly, about how we can develop models for sustainability, right, and resilience, right? Not only, quite unfortunately, on the international level, but even on the national and on the local level. And I think I will stop there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, Dr. Kevin Henry Villanueva, for that very powerful presentation. There's a new war, there's a new power that one has to think of and engage. So the various disciplines have to come together. But let me end there in terms of, on the matter of our presentations. That has been very rich set of presentation.